Hello and welcome to Cognitations, a podcast about cognitive science and how it can help us explore the wonderful quirks of the mind. Cognitive science is the interdisciplinary study of the mind. It is comprised of cognitive psychology, the neurosciences, linguistics, philosophy, social sciences, computer science, and more. Without further ado, here is today's episode.
I'm today's host, Tanay. In our last episode with Amy Orban, we discussed a big problem in the research on how social media potentially affects mental health. That is, a lot of studies ask really vague, broad questions. For instance, asking, what is social media doing to our mental health, is like asking, how does food affect young people's health? To really answer the latter question, we need to get more specific. For instance, are we talking about junk food or vegetables? And what about the kids' health history, like if they have diabetes or not? Some researchers think that using well-established theories from cognitive science can solve this problem by helping us ask better, more precise questions about social media. They also think it could lead to new ways of studying it beyond using measures of self-reported screen time and potentially offer novel policy insights. So what are these ideas from cognitive science? What new methods can we use? And how could they change things at the policy level? Our guests today are here to help answer those questions, or at least some of them. Our first guest is Georgia Turner. She is a third-year PhD student in the Digital Mental Health Group, supervised by Amy Orban at the University of Cambridge. In her PhD, she aims to understand why we feel we lose control of our technology use. To do so, she uses methods from computational neuroscience on real-world datasets, such as Twitter and smartphone recordings. As an undergraduate at Cambridge, Georgia studied philosophy for 2 years before switching to natural sciences. She then completed a master's in neuroscience in London at UCL and Paris at the La Sorbonne and ENS. Our second guest today is Lukas Gunschera. Lukas is a second-year PhD student in the same group, supervised by Amy at the University of Cambridge. He is interested in the cognitive mechanisms linking social media use and mental health. In his research, he uses a combination of computational, longitudinal, and experimental approaches to examine the processes driving the effects of social media use. Before starting his PhD, Lukas completed an MSc in psychological research at the University of Amsterdam and a BSc in psychology at Radboud University. Welcome, and thanks for taking the time to be here with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you. So just to kick us off and get some insights into how you got into cognitive science, for our listeners, could you describe your academic journey till now and how you got interested in studying the mind?
So as Tanay said, I started by studying philosophy because I was really interested in these big questions like what is the mind, what is free will, what is a good life, and all that kind of thing. But when I got to studying philosophy, I actually kind of started to realize that I preferred the scientific method of asking those questions, which is a really kind of the idea that what is really going to tell us how to answer these questions is real world data, and that's something that we can continue to learn from every day. So I started moving to science and ended up studying psychology and then neuroscience, and I really enjoyed that. And then I kind of came to social media as something that I'd always been interested in as a person my whole life. So I actually recorded a podcast on social media with my friend for fun in undergrad, I was remembering, long before I knew that you could study it.
But then when it's a full circle then.
I know, it's so weird when I was reflecting on preparing for this. So I kind of brought that like personal interest together with my academic interest in like the scientific method and mathematical methods, as well as a philosophical interest in what is free will, how do we have control over our actions, what is a good life. That's something that is always implicit when we ask questions about, is social media good or bad for you? And so I find it really stimulating that we can ask all those questions together in our research and also feel that it can have like really practical implications.
How are you, Lukas? How did you get interested in the mind?
Yeah, starting my undergrad at the Radboud University, I think that was more of a decision on a whim, really. I've, read popular psychology books and thought they were interesting and just signed up for this course that I thought sounded interesting. And as many people going into psychology, was primarily interested in becoming a clinician. And it was only later, through a few lucky coincidences and great mentors that I was lucky to meet that I got interested in doing research myself. Back then, there was a program for people who were thinking about going into research and had vaguely considered it and had signed up. And as a great mentor, we had many excellent conversations that really went into the direction of how, like, the mechanisms of how do things work, why do we do certain things. And I became really interested in that. So after that, I decided, okay, I'm done with trying to be a clinical psychologist and went to the research direction instead. And it was only, it's relatively early before my PhD that I started becoming interested in social media research, and not primarily necessarily from the perspective of just wanting to research social media as the platforms, but also seeing social media as a source of data that can help us answer many questions about social psychology, both on the online world, but also the offline social context.
So it seems like, just from your descriptions of how you describe your work and your journey so far, these are quite ambitious research programs in and of itself. And so, what is one thing about your work which people can't infer from your academic CV, which might appear to be quite impressive on paper?
So you won't be able to infer from my CV or from the very smooth description I gave when you first asked the first question, which is how unpredictable and how many kind of coincidences and turns have like brought me to where I am and continue to lead me to each thing that I do. So yeah, I think that's the main thing, just how much I never expected that this is where I would end up or planned it at all.
Fair. How about you, Lukas?
I had more time to think about this, but I still struggle. I think you couldn't even infer that I am somebody doing social media research in the first place, because papers take so long to publish. So if you look at my Google Scholar, there's not a single social media paper on there, really. Yeah, not sure how much that says about me as a person, potentially more just about the research process itself. Yeah.
No, fair enough. So I guess, like, let's get into the nitty-gritties of your work then. So as I mentioned in the introduction, Amy Orban in the previous episode talked about how people have historically asked broad questions in the social media, mental health literature. And a central point in both of your research programs is that using well-established theories from cognitive science can not only help us mitigate this problem by asking more precise questions, but also simultaneously provide novel methods to investigate these questions and maybe provide some targeted interventions. So let's start with the theories first. What cognitive science theories are useful for asking more sophisticated questions about social media's effects on mental health?
Yeah, I think without pointing to specific theories, I think theories in general, or good theories in general, have the characteristic that they help us ask more precise questions. And that can be your evolutionary theory, it can be your developmental theory, it can be more of like a psychosocial theory. I think what all of those theories, assuming they're good, have in common is that they propose certain mechanisms, how certain outcomes come about, and just help us ask more nuanced questions about social media. So, for instance, thinking about developmental theories, speaking about cognitive brain development in adolescence, and how, for instance, inclinations towards impulsivity or risk-taking change over development, can help us ask us more concrete questions about what is it during these periods at which we're particularly concerned about the effects of social media on well-being that is driving this. So, for instance, you could ask the more specific question, is it that changes in impulsiveness change the way in which adolescents engage with social media that would then determine their well-being outcomes, for instance?
Like, could you quickly define, because you mentioned two terms here, one is impulsivity and then the other is risk taking.
Yeah.
So just so that the audience is also on the same page, could you give maybe some more concrete examples of what these terms mean in the scientific literature?
Yeah. So, impulsivity, I think, often refers to across context instances where people are inclined to value rewards that are more immediate over rewards that are more delayed. So saying, in the context of social media, for instance, you might say an example of an impulsive decision would be, I'd rather stay inside and play video games, as opposed to studying for the test that might get me good grades or a good A level a few years down the line.
Right.
That's how you could think about impulsivity. And then risk-taking, I think, is... Yeah, how do you define risk-taking? I think risk-taking, again, a very applied example is all kinds of decisions. I mean, you weigh up the benefit versus the risk. Let's say I'm skateboarding and I'm thinking about what's the benefit of me going down this half pipe and doing this really cool trick. It might be that all your friends think you're cool. The risk is I break my arm or something, right? And it's how you weigh up those different outcomes, which you might define as risk-taking propensity. And individuals differ in how aversive they are to taking risks in pursuit of certain goals.
All right. Coming on to you, Georgia. What sort of cognitive science theories do you have in mind?
Yeah, so the really difficult thing about theory in social media research is that most cognitive science theories developed over decades before social media even existed. And many people in social media research have seen that as a weakness of them, and therefore we just have to develop new theories for social media. But instead, I actually think thinking of ways in which it could be a strength that a theory has perfectly or very well described how the human system works before social media can help us to understand social media, because it can help us to understand what might be going wrong in some cases, or how we might change social media to encourage the ways in which things worked without social media. So firstly, characterizing something, how it worked before social media, and also theories which link the agent, also the human, to their environment. So theories which tell us what kind of environments are most helpful for us, because then social media we can really think of as an environment like other kinds of environments, like school or like as being on a beach, like any kind of context that you're in. And so if we can think of social media as another kind of environment, we can extrapolate from what we know about what kinds of environments are beneficial for us to understand how the social media environment can be beneficial for us.
And so I suppose that I think the neat thing about this idea that social media is just another type of environment, and how sort of understanding cognitive processes that link humans to their environment might be a way forward. Is there any particular framework you have in mind that sort of makes this connection?
Yeah, so there are many, but the one that we've been focusing on in our research recently is theories which describe the human reward learning system. So it describes how humans and other animals learn to maximize the rewards that they can obtain in a given environment. So rewards are anything that we ascribe value to, and that's usually something that has some kind of connection at some point to something that we fundamentally need. So food is an obvious reward, as well as like social connection. But if we think of social connection, it's such an abstract and often complex thing that we also have things along the way that we start to value, like social, which we would call social rewards. So that might be seeing a smile, or giving a gift to a friend. And then in the social media world, we've got all sorts of new social rewards as well, like likes. So reward learning theories help us understand how humans learn to search out and maximize those rewards. And the way that links to the environment is that we have adapted to develop specific strategies which are well suited to the kinds of environments that we evolved and developed in. And that's really key, because the best way to obtain a reward depends on the structure of the environment you're in. So yeah.
Okay. So I suppose like both with the ideas of like frameworks, like thinking about impulsivity or risk taking, or this idea of reward learning, they might sort of help in asking these precise questions about social media, for instance, like how does reward learning work with these new types of social rewards in this new social environment? But then theories alone aren't enough for this debate, right? Like we also need rigorous methods to test the hypotheses that they generate. And given that social media companies currently retain data from researchers, a novel value addition from the ideas that you guys have mentioned so far is that they also provide innovative methods to either leverage publicly available data or use pre-existing experimental paradigms in cognitive science to answer the vital question of how social media can affect mental health. So maybe let's start with you, Georgia, here, because you've sort of put out a recent paper which talks about very specific examples of how reward learning might provide new experimental paradigms to test this big question of how social media can affect mental health. So maybe you can kick us off there.
So what we decided to do, which we had been inspired by a first study by Björn Lindstrom, who first had this idea, which is that so typically reward learning models, which are mathematical kind of descriptions of behavior, are used in psychology to describe experimental data. So that's data that you've collected in a lab experiment, like, for example, famously, a rat learning to press a lever more when it gets more rewards available. You can describe that with a mathematical model known as reinforcement learning. So that's kind of just the formal way that we talk about reward learning in computational neuroscience. It's a particular framework. So we've taken that kind of reinforcement learning model that you can use to describe experimental data and now combined it with this very new opportunity to actually, instead of using slotting experimental data, slotting real world social media data, which users have, people leave as kind of digital footprints, and seeing if that we can describe that data with the same models that we describe lab data. So what we've done in our study is we obtained Twitter data. I use the word Twitter because we obtained it before the company became X, where we got that from the API of Twitter.
What is an API?
What does API stand for? Lukas is going to take that one.
It's an application programming interface. So it can be used in the context of research, where it helps researchers get the actual data from the social media platforms. In your case now, the actual tweets that people put out and the timings and so on. But it's also how different companies build like interfaces for platforms and so on and so on. So it's quite versatile. But in the context of research, it's something we use to get access to granular data.
Gotcha.
So the application programming interface allowed us to download large amounts of Twitter data for each user that consented for us to do so. And for each user, we obtained the times at which they posted on Twitter and how many likes they got on each post that they did. Okay. And then we combined that with questionnaire data, where they told us their age, gender, and filled out a mental well-being questionnaire.
Okay, so, and like what is one of the primary findings here, like when you applied this model to this data set?
Yeah, so the first thing we did was we adapted directly a reinforcement learning model from the animal literature, which describe experimental data, to describe the Twitter data, to try and see the extent to which the rewards on Twitter, so the likes people received, motivated them to alter the speed at which they posted on Twitter. Okay. So the very basic intuition behind this model is simply that if you're getting more likes, you're likely to post more quickly because it's worth doing that in order to obtain more likes. Whereas if you're getting fewer likes, you would post more slowly because it's not worth the effort of posting quickly to obtain rewards. So that was the model that we checked. And we basically found that actually the best description of the cognitive processes determining people's behavior on Twitter was that they used a combination of this simple reward learning process plus a habitual process. So a habitual process is the propensity to just repeat actions which have worked in the past and been rewarded in the past on an almost automatic basis. So you just kind of keep doing it because it worked before, even if it's not working anymore.
So there's no conscious thought involved here. Is that correct to say?
It's a good question. I'm staying away from the concept of conscious thought because I don't actually know exactly how these different behavioral processes map onto conscious thought. we do know from psychological research that different behavioral systems are constantly contributing to the behavior that we output. And we're kind of used to that if we think about, for example, reflexes, like that we know that like sometimes automatically our body chooses to do something that we didn't completely control with the same reflexive system. But actually that's just one example. There's the reflex, there's habits, there's the reward learning, and then loads of other behavioral systems constantly battling or coordinating to control that behavior. And the kind of the place of consciousness is a difficult one. I'm not sure.
So could I just maybe I didn't quite follow the difference between a reflex and a habit, where you sort of talked about this body reflex, right? And like I suppose like from a layman's intuition, when you think of habit, like I think of things like smoking, where you've smoked in the past, it's sort of rewarding, you feel nice about it, and then it sort of becomes habitual in that there are moments where you feel an itch to just smoke. How is that different from a reflex?
So smoking is another one that I wouldn't necessarily describe as a habit because it can become a physical addiction. So I think after a while that I would distinguish from habits. I might think of something more neutral, like if you walk into your kitchen, you kind of might automatically just open the fridge, even if you're not hungry. Sometimes just the context of being in your kitchen, you just walk in, mindlessly open the fridge, and then you realize actually you were in there for a different reason, but you've picked up this habit that like went in kitchen, open fridge door.
Right.
So that is distinguishable from, that's a habit, and I would distinguish that from a reflex, or the habit, actually, I'll quickly choose a social one, which is like the habit of just saying thank you when someone does something to you. Sometimes you might just do that without thinking. A reflex, I am actually not trained on exactly the definition of reflex, but I would think of it as like a more physical thing that's like kind of just like as a spinal system, like that is for very specific purposes, like jumping or like blinking at certain points.
Right. So I guess like just coming back to the study that you did, which was quite novel in that you sort of used this large data set of tweets and just showed that there is some sort of reward learning behavior that's driving posting. You also sort of find some very interesting individual differences that's sort of driving this posting behavior. Could you maybe talk about that quickly?
Yeah, so we were interested, once we characterized this process, the different variations in this process also relate to other kind of things that we know about the Twitter users, so that we might be able to start a kind of intuition here is that maybe the ways in which people learn by rewards on Twitter might be important for understanding why different people have different relationships with social media. And we know already that demographics might be an important difference. So we know that different genders and different ages use social media differently. So could this kind of be a mechanism underlying that difference? We first just found that more frequent posters on Twitter had a higher habitual contribution of the habit system, which was interesting and very much what we expected. Basically just showed that the model worked, that it was picking out that these were more habitual people.
And by that, you mean that these people weren't necessarily driven by the amount of likes that they got, they just kept posting?
Yeah, exactly. They were less driven by it. We then found that across our sample, so that went from young adolescents up to the age of 80, younger people and females or women had a higher contribution of the reward learning system than the habit system. So they were more likely to be changing their behavior in response to likes. Yeah.
But then I guess the question I have here, because this sort of runs contrary to a intuition that's sort of present in the public consciousness regarding how adolescents are depicted using social media, where it's like, oh, it's the adolescents that is sort of like habitually sucked into social media. But then I guess your study sort of shows the inverse, where it's actually that the younger people are much more flexible.
Yeah, so it doesn't show. Yeah, so really good question. The one of the other cool things about using real world data is that we can check how much what we expect necessarily generalizes. So this was very specific to posting on Twitter. I would not necessarily expect that finding to generalize to like all other social media behaviors like scrolling, and maybe not even other social media platforms. I would also say that this effect was, I think it would be interesting to kind of follow up this effect and see. I bet there's many more individual differences that are much more specific that determine how you use social media. And this is kind of a very coarse division on like gender and age. So I think it's definitely not the whole story. But I think it's like a first kind of demonstration that you can use this method to find a difference on a certain data set. And it will be interesting to see how that extends to other data sets and other behaviors.
Cool. So let's move on to you, Lucas. Your work also uses elements of reinforcement learning and sort of thinking about the ideas that we were chatting about before in terms of risk-taking and impulsivity. You also use some novel paradigms to sort of examine the effects of social media on well-being. So maybe if you could sort of talk us through more concretely some of the ideas that you've been working on and what were the methods involved, that would be quite illuminating.
Yes. So I've been working on a project where we are interested in how cognitive processes shape how social media affects our well-being. And I want to relate to an example that Amy mentioned during the previous episode, where she was talking about how hearing your friend speak about or posting about their job promotion in one context might make you feel very happy and you're excited for your friend. In another context, however, if you yourself have been struggling at work and have been asking for promotion for quite some time, seeing that same post might make you feel very different. So that's a contextual factor that you have relatively little control over, let's say. The idea is that across these social contexts and how these social contexts impact me as a person, a potentially more stable factor lies within myself, which is the cognitive processes which shape how I engage with the world, but also how I perceive the world. So we may think that, I don't know, let's say my impulsiveness might more consistently across contexts determine how the social information I receive impacts me as an individual. And that's the general idea when we start thinking about how do these processes really shape the outcomes of social media and well-being. It's not maybe that social media across all individuals has the same effect, but there might be those individual differences in some of these processes that actually shape the outcomes that we do observe. So to research this, we got access to a large longitudinal data set called the Leiden Consortium on Individual Development, which for Dutch children, I think starting with the age of 12, for 7 years, and on an annual basis had several measurements relating to well-being, how much they use social media, as well as a task relating to impulsivity. So what we wanted to assess is whether in a longitudinal manner, so seeing whether this is the case across different measurement occasions and also getting at things such as bidirectionality. So the question, does social media affect your well-being, or is it your well-being that affects your social media use? We looked at whether impulsivity changes or moderates the relationship between social media use and well-being, specifically reward responsiveness.
And what do you mean by reward responsiveness?
Yeah, so in this context, it was measured with a self-report scale, including items that generally get at things such as how responsive are you to rewards, to at the top of my head, I can't say any specific items, but yeah, how responsive are you to rewards? How much are you driven by rewarding outcomes in your behavior? I think that's a general idea.
Okay.
And what we found was that in general, we didn't find any associations longitudinally between social media use and mental health or reward responsiveness, saying across our entire sample, there wasn't really an association. What we did find is that increased social media use at one time point was associated with decreased reward sensitivity at the subsequent measurement point. And interestingly, so what, to put that into context, what that means is if I, in one instance, use more social media than I as a person would on average, that relates to decreased reward responsiveness later on.
Okay. I guess I'm still sort of struggling to wrap my head around reward responsiveness. So would the idea be like, I know you don't have the particular items off the top of your head, but is it to say that you get, I'm thinking of like very everyday examples, like the marshmallow test. Like, would you want a marshmallow today or like 10 marshmallows in like an hour? Is that the general idea here?
I think that would get more at things like impulsiveness, which obviously touches upon things.
Yeah.
Like, as I explained earlier, it relates to how to evaluate the rewards in my environment. I think reward responsiveness would be more so, I think also in the context of Georgia's research, thinking of like how I post, it would be I change my behavior more in response to the rewards that I get, as opposed to being more agnostic to it. And
I see. Okay.
more habitual or
Okay.
some other reason for your behavior. Does that make it more?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So like coming back to the main takeaway then, you find that increased social media use sort of changes your responsiveness to reward.
Yeah, but now actually coming to the more interesting bit, in my opinion, is the moderation. So how is this relationship affected by levels of impulsivity?
Yeah.
What we found was that individuals who were more impulsive showed this negative relationship between social media use and reward responsiveness, more so than individuals who are less impulsive.
Right.
So that's a lot. So let me break that down again. So using more social media at one time point is associated with less reward responsiveness later on. However, an individual who is less impulsive, for those individuals, we found that relationship to be less strong. So this decrease in reward responsiveness as a function of increased social media use is less compared to an individual who is more impulsive.
Right. And so here though, I guess the general big picture question still would be that you still used sort of, how did you measure social media usage here?
Yes. Sadly, using, so we had an item that gets specifically at the amount of time that children would spend posting and scrolling on social media. So it's specifically about those activities. Now, I definitely echo a lot of the criticism about time spent measures. In the context of research, I mean, you work with what you get. I think if, I had designed the study myself from the very beginning, obviously you might do things differently. But with the data that we do have, I think in this context of thinking about how do cognitive processes shape our social media experiences, but also how we engage with it, it's still interesting from the perspective that the idea is that, let's say two people have the same amount of time they spend on social media. Individual differences in, let's say, impulsiveness might determine what the child actually does during that time. So hopefully it provides some more insight than just crude time spent.
Right. Studies. And so maybe like to sort of extrapolate the idea further, the idea would be that if you can sort of identify the source of the individual differences, maybe you can target specific interventions to individuals who might need it the most.
I think in general, that is definitely one of the driving ideas that is pushing these efforts to do more nuanced social media research, because what people are finding is across the board, across all the individuals, the findings aren't super convincing. We don't find these major effects. And the question is, who is particularly at risk?
Right.
Who is more likely to experience positive outcomes?
Yeah.
And the idea is that cognitive processes can help us potentially understand that at a mechanistic level.
Okay. I think this is a good segue for the next set of questions, which I wanted to ask you guys about, since we're talking about intervention design. So it seems like these interrelated ideas of reward learning, impulsivity, risk-taking can sort of maybe help us, as you, Lucas, put it, identify the individuals who might be particularly vulnerable to social media use. And a lot of these ideas about reward learning and impulsivity also relate to public ideas about addiction. So yeah, maybe let's talk about social media addiction. What is social media addiction? Why is it hard to define? And any one of you is open to take that.
Yeah. I mean, I can tell you about how social media addiction is currently being measured. I can't necessarily tell you what it is. How it's predominantly measured in the literature right now is using symptoms that we know from drug addiction and extrapolating those onto social media. So it's things like withdrawal, needing more of a substance to get the same effects, things like that kind of shapes our layman understanding of what social media addiction is. And that's measured with self-report questionnaires that ask people about exactly those kind of symptoms.
So initially you prefaced your response by saying that you can't really tell me what social media addiction is, but you can tell me how it's measured. I find that a bit puzzling. If you could measure it, why could you not tell me what it is? Are there deep philosophical issues in sort of defining social media addiction?
Yeah, I mean, if you throw a self-report questionnaire at somebody, you're measuring something. The question is whether you're measuring what you actually intend to measure. And that's what I'm more skeptical of. So how people define social media addiction, or in some studies that talk about social media addiction, that's what they use. The question is, do these questionnaires capture the addictive process that we do know from drug research, where we have decades of biological research based on rat models and so on and so on. So there's quite a contrast between how this is researched and validated in the social media context and how it's validated in other.
Right. And what would the core of that addictive process be if something like social media addiction really exists?
So can you...
So you mentioned that there's like decades of like biological research on addiction, which captures the actual mechanics of what drives addiction. What would social media addiction require, building on this research, for it to qualify as an addiction?
Yeah. I think one of the things it requires is not just testing it or constructing our measurement based on our intuition. I think that can be very problematic because addiction is a loaded construct. We have layman intuitions about what addiction is. It doesn't necessarily mean that those are the processes implicated in actual addiction. So I think what it requires is more research looking at the biological and cognitive, psychological processes implicated in addiction in the social media context. And that's something that hasn't really been done so far in the context of social media.
I see. I suppose that another way of how people have been talking about social media addiction is using terms like problematic social media usage. And at least my understanding from the literature is that people do see this as something that needs to be solved. But then given how you sort of talk about the difficulties in sort of defining social media addiction, it seems like a very nuanced issue. Would you sort of know what kinds of interventions currently exist for reducing quote unquote problematic social media usage?
Yeah. Digital detoxes is one of the interventions that's also more highly researched, which asks, well, people often self-selected based on their perception that they have a problematic relationship with social media and would like to cut down on the time they spend on it, say, okay, I'd like to take part in this research and decide to, I don't know, do things like uninstall Facebook for a week or maybe get a brick phone for 2 weeks. Interventions of that nature. I think thinking back to what addiction is and what we know about addiction, especially in the context of substance addiction, it's not really how it works. If you are an alcohol addict and you have a problem, you're not doing a detox for 2 weeks and then going back to drinking alcohol casually on a Friday evening. You're going to cut out alcohol for the rest of your life, ideally. So I think there's discrepancies. If we apply this idea of social media addiction, I think there's an inconsistency then if we speak about detoxes that take 2 weeks and then you go back to using social media and that's meant to solve your addiction. I'm skeptical of that.
I see. So moving on to you, Georgia, given all these complexities that Lukas has just outlined, are there any tentative solutions that the framework of reward learning and reinforcement learning provides for more innovative intervention design?
Yeah, that's a great question. And from now on, it's going to be me speculating because that's where the research is. But we do have things I can speculate on, which is kind of what's motivated us to do this research in the first place. So big qualifier, this is made up, but based on some training and research. Okay, so I would say when we ask about solutions, like implicit in that is like, who are we expecting to take action? Because there's different kinds of actions available to different parties, and reward learning can help us with those different, can help many of those different people. So one thing that we could think of is like reward learning, particularly fitted to real world social media data, could help us understand on a large scale level how the effects of certain design features of social media impact different reward learning behaviors. So it might be that quantifiable, so for example, not hiding the like count, or showing people how many views they got, or having a public versus private profile, or having messages disappear. So those kind of small changes to the structure of the social media environment could have big impacts on the reward learning strategies that they encourage. We already know, for example, that habits are more encouraged by certain types of environments. So we know that habitual behavior is maintained by variable reward schedules, which means unpredictable times at which you're receiving a reward, as well as stable context. So things that when the concept I said earlier that when a stable coming into the same context cues a habit. So in the same way, like a stable social media context, for example, like the news feed with the infinite scroll, might encourage a more habitual kind of behavior. So those kind of, in that way, reward learning can help us with solutions that social media companies or regulators like policymakers could use to intervene to change the structure of social media design features in reward. So that could be one. And then, so I've kind of covered companies and regulators, and now I'll think about the social media users. And like, we can also design to an extent our social media experience by not thinking that we have to take the social media interface as it's given to us, but instead switching off and disenabling the different features that we think are encouraging our certain behaviors. So I told you that variable reward schedules can motivate sort of reward seeking behaviors. So you might think my notifications come on a variable reward schedule. I'm instead going to alter the notification structure on my phone so that I don't get any notifications and I only find out my phone messages when I look at it, so that I'm in control of the times at which I receive social media rewards and I don't have these like reward schedules motivating me. But yeah, in general, just thinking about how you can change the features of your own social media environment.
Right. So I do find this idea quite interesting, where like just taking the idea of reward learning quite seriously, you have a population level solution where you can evaluate the efficacy of different features on reward learning, but also sort of it shifts back the agency to the user, where like users can sort of take certain actions. I suppose the question I wanted to ask with regards to the former, in terms of evaluating feature designs and how that impacts human psychology and reward learning, am I correct to presume that this sort of evaluation could be done without social media companies providing access to their data sets? Like you could, as you were mentioning with your Twitter project earlier, you could just scrape this data off the internet.
We're in a current situation where social media companies have a huge amount of access to social media data, which they continue to use for their internal research. And external researchers have much less research resources in that sense. So yes, we would be much more advantaged if we could get access to social media data. For example, there is already policy coming in both at the UK and EU level, mandating social media companies to provide external researchers with access to their data for research.
Gotcha.
Can I quickly jump in, but also to point out, like, the way that you've gotten access to the data that the reinforcement work is based on? That's actually, like, the API, that's something, application programming interface, is something that is provided by the company, right? So it's not like it's data that's necessarily freely out there. And especially with recent developments, many of the companies have been decreasing access to application programming interfaces or increase their cost and stuff like that. So that's critical infrastructure that researchers have often been using to get access to quite detailed data.
Right.
But not a given.
Yeah.
Does that?
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And there are complex questions with user privacy,
Hmm.
which is often the argument for not sharing data more freely. But I think that our answers to those questions, they just might be a bit complex. And it's really something that I think policy needs to start thinking about how to facilitate access.
Yeah. So I think this sounds like a good point where we can start wrapping up. So before I do that, is there anything that I didn't sort of bring up or cover during an interview, which you would, or any point that you talked about, which you would want to sort of go over or wished you had said something more?
I think it's good. I was just now thinking, I was reflecting on where I was speaking about the detox, and I was saying that there's like an inconsistency in thinking. I just wanted to point out that by saying that, I don't necessarily mean that you should be taking that to the extreme and say, oh, you do need to cut out social media for the rest of your life. It was more to point out an inconsistency in a train of thought, that if you say social media is addictive, which is an empirical statement that is, in my opinion, yet to be confirmed, then our approach, if we talk about detoxes, should not be, let's take a detox for 2 weeks and then go back to using it as before, or slightly less.
Do you have, before we finally wrap up, we often ask our interviewees if they have any media recommendations or book recommendations with regards to the topics that we just discussed during the interview. Do you have any such recommendations for the audience?
I can start. Models of the Mind from Grace Lindsay. She's a professor at NYU. And it speaks about how mathematical models have been used to understand brain processes, decision-making, memory, and so on. And I think so in the podcast today, we focused a lot on how does it help us ask more concrete questions. But I think another very important benefit of the methods that both George and I are working with is formulating concrete hypotheses and making your assumptions clear and so on, things that psychology has struggled with for a long time. And I find it very cool to see how people come up with these models that reflect our assumptions about how the brain works, how cognition works, and representing that in a model that allows for us to test very cool questions.
Sounds like perfect bedtime reading. How are you, Jojo?
Just to comment on that, I haven't read that, but I love that description. And I think that's a really nice thing to point out about our work, which is like we're using mathematical models to describe human behavior. Like that itself is crazy. Why should that work? It's very, very like recent that that's even being considered possible. It used to be just like physics was the mathsy subject. And so that's something like, yeah, it sounds like a cool book, even though I haven't read it myself. But yeah. Okay, so the book I'm going to recommend is called The Man Without a Shadow by Joyce Carol Oates. And okay, I continuously link this to social media. I think it more directly applies to psychological research that we do. But what it is it's a fictionalized story of a true story of a man called H.M. who was the subject of he was kind of the foundation of a lot of modern psychology, and it was around in the 50s where he had an operation to have a large part of his brain removed to cure his epilepsy. And what it instead did was they removed part of the brain which we now know as the hippocampus, which was responsible for recording certain types of short-term memory. And so he got in this very specific memory situation where he had long-term memory but not short-term memory, and he was studied for 50 years. And so the story is a fictionalized tale about him and about a woman scientist who is working with him, and it's about how her personal relationship with him develops, and she has to balance career, and it's about being a woman psychologist at that time. It's also about what cognitive capacities make us who we are. Like, is this she ends up basically feeling romantically towards him, and like is like what kind of something we really think about when studying psychology is you can really actually separate all aspects of a person's cognitive capacities in mind, and at what point do you get to the one that really determines who they are? Linking that back to social media tenuously, I think we talk a lot about I think with social media, we're now talking more than we were before about losing control of our own behavior on an everyday basis. I don't know if that's something that everyone had to live with until now. We constantly talk about social media, but now we're constantly having to ask questions about like, okay, so is my behavior who I am? Like, am I controlling? So yeah, I just think that kind of question is also raised by this book, and it's a cool book, so have a read.
Wow, no, that's a very poetic note to end the podcast on. So this has been Cognitions. I'm today's host, Tanay, and I have been chatting with Georgia and Lukas. Thanks so much for the interview.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
On the next episode of Cognitions, we'll be joined by Dr. Daniel Presnetzo to explore the world of auditory illusions. You've probably seen an optical illusion before, but did you know your ears can be just as easily tricked? These unique illusions provide a neat toolkit for investigating how our auditory system works. Make sure to check it out.